Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling green methanol.
Yeah.
So this is something that's getting, a lot of buzz. Obviously, we need cleaner solutions for industries, and also for fuels that power, our world. And green methanol has really emerged as like a leading contender, not just for chemicals, but also potentially for shipping as well. And for those who need a refresher, green methanol is made from renewable electricity, water, and captured CO2.
Right. So, our listener, are probably curious about, how we can transition to more sustainable energy solutions.
Hmm.
And, it could be difficult to kind of grasp these complex topics. But that's why we're here. We're going to break it down for you, this deep dive, explore what green methanol is, the global potential for producing it, and then, crucially, also address whether green methanol can um, be cost competitive with, how we make methanol today.
Yeah, exactly. So today our mission is to really understand the global potential and the cost effectiveness of producing green methanol. And we're going to do this by looking at a really interesting recent scientific study that analyzed various factors from 2020 to 2050.
Yes, so the study, Global Production Potential of Green Methanol Based on Variable Renewable Electricity, was published this year in Energy and Environmental Science.
Okay.
And it offers a very granular analysis because they use hourly optimization and a really high spatial resolution. So
Wow.
they're looking at things down to 0.451 by 0.451 degrees globally.
Okay, so let's dive in. First things first. Just what is methanol and why is green methanol such a big deal?
Yeah, so methanol in its current form is a major petrochemical that's used for tons of different things, from automotive parts to construction materials to pharmaceuticals.
Wow.
In 2021, the global production volume was 107 million tons.
That's a lot.
It's a lot of methanol.
So what's the problem with the way we're producing it now?
Well, currently, conventional methanol production heavily relies on fossil fuels, mainly natural gas,
Okay.
and it results in substantial CO2 emissions. So for every ton of methanol produced, you're emitting between zero point 0.5 to 1.5 tons of CO2. And then, of course, if you combust that methanol for energy, there's potential for even more CO2 emissions,
Right.
right? So that kind of leads into why, green methanol is so important.
Yeah, because obviously climate change is a huge issue.
Right.
We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Exactly, exactly. So that's why the shift to green methanol is so important. We need to decarbonize these industries and fuels. So green methanol, like I said, is produced using renewable electricity, primarily solar PV and wind. So that electricity powers electrolyzers, which then split water into hydrogen and oxygen. Then the green hydrogen is combined with CO2 that's captured directly from the atmosphere using direct air capture, or DAC.
Oh, okay. So that's really interesting. And, another thing that I thought was interesting was that existing methanol synthesis plants can be adapted for green methanol production.
Yeah, that's a big plus.
Yeah.
Because we wouldn't necessarily need to build an entirely new infrastructure from scratch. We can just kind of retrofit existing plants.
Okay, that's great. Now, what I thought was really interesting too was the study noted that the demand for methanol is increasing, something like 5 to 7% annual growth. Um, but green methanol could potentially meet that demand and even exceed it.
Yeah, so just for conventional uses alone, the demand for methanol could reach um, somewhere between 440 and 761 mets per year by 2050.
Wow.
But, there are other potential uses that could expand the demand even further. For example, methanol could be used as a feedstock for other chemicals, a fuel for marine transport, or even as a sustainable aviation fuel. You can go from e-methanol to kerosene through a chemical process.
Okay, so it sounds like green methanol could potentially play like a really crucial role in transitioning, many different sectors to a lower carbon future.
Exactly.
Now I've heard about this concept of a methanol economy. What does that even mean?
Yes, so the idea is that methanol would be a kind of a widespread substitute for fossil fuels in different applications.
Mm-hmm.
And this addresses some of the limitations that we've seen um, discussed for the hydrogen economy. So both the hydrogen economy and the methanol economy are both kind of part of this broader power to X economy concept, where essentially, we're going to be relying much more on renewable electricity as our primary source of energy. And then you have these kind of energy carriers like hydrogen and methanol that will be used to kind of, store that energy, transport that energy, and then also be used as chemical feedstocks.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Now, the study mentioned that direct CO2 hydrogenation is the preferred method for green methanol production.
Right.
Why is that?
So the reason for that is this method is more energy efficient and cost efficient. And also, it typically requires less cooling and has a similar plant design than other methods that might involve, like producing syngas, which is a mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen, as an intermediate step.
Okay. So, are there any actual real-world examples of, green methanol production happening right now?
Yeah, actually there are. So Carbon Recycling International, or CRI, has commissioned commercial-scale CO2 to methanol plants in China.
Wow.
And these plants are utilizing industrial waste CO2 and renewable hydrogen. And they also have a plant planned in Norway that will be using industrial waste CO2 and hydrogen produced from high power.
Okay, so this is already happening. It's not just theoretical.
Yeah, it's becoming a reality.
All right, well, let's move on to the study's approach and their findings. How did they go about figuring out all of this stuff?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, they used hourly optimization of these hybrid PV wind power to methanol systems at a really high spatial resolution globally, as I mentioned, from 2020 to 2050. So they were looking at this, really in a very fine-grained way. And this hourly optimization is important because obviously the output of solar and wind power fluctuates, throughout the day and throughout the year. So they wanted to really capture that in their analysis.
Right. So what were some of their key findings when it comes to electricity generation, since that's kind of like the first step in this process?
Yeah, so what they found was that solar PV is projected to be the dominant source of electricity generation in most parts of the world by 2030,
Oh, wow.
with wind potentially playing a larger role in a few specific regions like Patagonia, Central and Northern Europe, Midwestern U.S., and high-latitude areas. And they actually project that this trend will, continue to strengthen by 2050. So solar is really going to be the dominant player here. And then in terms of the different types of technology, they considered fixed tilt PV, single axis tracking PV, and of course, wind. And they also factored in things like energy storage, including, batteries, hydrogen storage, and they considered different types of hydrogen storage like salt caverns, rock caverns, and underground pipes. And from 2030 onwards, they even looked at the use of hydrogen-fueled gas turbines for seasonal balancing.
Okay, so really comprehensive. What about electricity curtailment?
Yeah, so what they found is that some electricity curtailment, meaning that sometimes you have more renewable energy being generated than you can use at that moment, is actually part of the cost-optimized solution. And this curtailment could be anywhere from 2 to 10%, and potentially higher in areas with high power seasonality, like Eastern Russia, for example.
Okay, so it's cheaper in some situations to just kind of let that energy go to waste.
Exactly. Yeah, it might seem counterintuitive, but sometimes building enough storage or other balancing mechanisms to capture every little bit of renewable energy can actually be more expensive than just letting some of it go unused.
Okay.
And they even project that curtailment might increase slightly by 2050.
Oh, wow. Okay. So what about batteries then? What role do they play?
So they found that batteries do have a role to play, but it's a bit more limited. So batteries are mainly used for short-term balancing, especially in PV-heavy regions, to help smooth out kind of the fluctuations in solar power and ensure like a more consistent power supply to things like, the DAC process and the methanol synthesis process. They're not going to be storing massive amounts of energy, but they will play a role in sort of smoothing things out in the short term.
Okay, so, and what about the cost of delivered electricity? After taking into account all of those balancing solutions.
So the good news is that they project that the cost of delivered electricity is expected to decrease significantly over time. So in 2020, it was estimated to be around 25 to 30 euros per megawatt hour. But by 2050, they project that it could fall to 8 to 11 euros per megawatt hour at the best sites.
Wow, that's a huge drop. Okay, so that's a really good sign.
Yeah.
So obviously that would be a major factor in making green methanol more cost competitive. What does the study say about the projected cost of green methanol as we move towards 2050?
Yeah, so they estimate that the cost of green methanol at the best global sites will decrease from about 1,200 to 1,500 euros per ton of methanol in 2020 down to 315 to 370 euros per ton in 2050.
Wow.
So, we're talking about a pretty substantial cost reduction over the next few decades. And this is mainly driven by the decreasing cost of renewable electricity generation and also improvements in technologies like DAC and electrolysis. They also found that the Atacama Desert in Chile consistently emerged as one of the lowest cost locations.
Oh, that's interesting. So are we going to get to a point where green methanol is actually cheaper than the conventional methanol that we're using now?
Yeah, so their projections indicate that the cost of green methanol could actually fall within the current market price range for conventional methanol by 2040. So we're talking about, potentially achieving defossilization without extra cost to consumers.
Okay. Now, that being said, I'm sure there are some caveats to that, right?
Right. So they do point out that if natural gas prices stay very low, like below 11 US dollars per ME2, e-methanol might still be a little bit more expensive than natural gas-based methanol.
Okay.
But if you introduce a cost for CO2 emissions, something like 150 euros per ton of CO2, that would make green methanol much more competitive.
So it's all about kind of, putting a price on that pollution,
Exactly.
and then it will make more economic sense to switch to the cleaner alternative.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So, we've talked about the cost, but what about the sheer volume, the production potential? How much of this stuff could we actually make?
Yeah, so the study estimates that the theoretical global production potential of green methanol could increase from about 70 gigahertz in 2020 to 170 gigahertz in 2050.
That's a huge number.
It's a massive amount, and this is far beyond what's needed just to decarbonize the chemical industry.
Yeah.
So there's, definitely a lot of potential here. And they also point out that even the first 20 gates of green methanol production could be produced at the lower end of the cost ranges that I mentioned earlier for 2030, 2040, and 2050. So, there's sufficient potential here to really make a significant impact on a global scale.
Wow. And what about regional differences? Are there some places that are better suited for this kind of production?
Yeah, so they found that the production potential per square kilometer is generally higher in PV-dominated regions, simply because solar PV has a better electricity yield per area than wind.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So, we've looked at the overall cost and production potential. Let's break down those costs a little bit. What are the main factors that contribute to the cost of producing green methanol?
So they looked at the cost distribution in 2030 at a few sample locations, and they found that the main cost components are electricity generation, followed by the non-energetic costs of DAC, non-energetic costs of the electrolyzer, and then the methanol synthesis plant itself.
Okay, so electricity is a big one,
Yeah.
and then the DAC costs are expected to go down significantly by 2050.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, they found that the non-energetic costs of DAC are projected to see the sharpest reduction among all the technologies by 2050.
Okay.
And this is, again, particularly beneficial for PV-dominated regions because, as electricity costs decrease, the overall cost of DAC will also decrease.
Okay. Now, what about the cost of capturing CO2 with DAC, in the near future?
So they estimate that in 2030, the cost of CO2 captured via DAC will be in the range of 163 to 195 euros per ton of CO2, which is down from the estimated cost in 2020.
Okay.
And this also highlights why it might be advantageous in the near term to utilize, cheaper sources of sustainable CO2, like those from industrial processes.
Right. So kind of like a stepping stone.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, what about the overall efficiency of this whole process?
Yeah, so they estimate that the overall efficiency of the power-to-methanol chain will increase from 38 to 45% in 2020 to 45 to 55% in 2050.
Okay. So it's getting better over time.
Yeah, thanks to, technological improvements.
Okay. Now, let's talk about land use. How much land do we actually need to produce a significant amount of green methanol?
Right. So to produce one bed of e-methanol per year, they estimate that you would need about 55 to 500 square kilometers of land in 2030 for the hybrid PG wind systems. And then in 2050, that decreases to 45 to 400 square kilometers. So again, the lower end of that range is for, the PV-dominated regions, and the higher end is for regions that are more reliant on wind power.
Okay. So obviously land use is something that we need to think about, but the area requirements are not unreasonable.
Right.
Okay, now what about the full load hours of the different components?
Yeah, so they looked at the full load hours of the electrolyzers, the jack, and the methanol synthesis plant. And they found that in 2030, the electrolyzers will have relatively lower full load hours in PV-dominated regions and higher full load hours in regions with good wind resources.
Okay.
And then the DAC is projected to operate at very high full load hours, around 7,000 to 8,000 hours.
Wow.
And the methanol synthesis plant also shows very high full load hours, just slightly lower than the DAC. And that suggests that, you might need some CO2 storage to, ensure a continuous supply to the methanol plant.
Right.
And then, of course, the availability of hydrogen storage also impacts the full load hours of the methanol plant.
Okay, so these are all things that we need to take into account, when we're designing these systems.
Exactly.
Now, what about the role of hydrogen balancing technologies?
Yeah, so they looked at things like compressor capacity, storage capacity, and the amount of hydrogen that is cycled through storage. And they found that compressor capacity is particularly significant in PV-dominated regions because, when you have a lot of solar power, you need to be able to compress that hydrogen and store it. The storage capacity requirements vary a lot depending on the technology availability and the, power seasonality of the region.
Okay.
But it can range from, tens to thousands of GeVo up to H2 for a 1 mount per year plant in 2030.
Gotcha.
And they also mentioned that flexible methanol plant operation could be important in regions with high power seasonality and limited hydrogen storage. So you might have to, kind of ramp down the methanol plant operation during times when renewable energy output is low.
Okay. So what about waste heat?
Yeah, so they found that waste heat from the electrolyzers can be utilized by heat pumps to provide a large portion of the heat demand for the DAC.
Oh, okay.
So they estimate that, anywhere from 50 to 90% of the heat demand for the DAC can be met by, waste heat from the electrolyzers. And then the rest would be supplied by electric water boilers. And they project that this utilization of waste heat will actually increase further by 2050.
Okay, that's great. So let's compare green methanol with conventional methanol in terms of price. How do they stack up?
Yeah, so the historical price range of conventional methanol has been, roughly between 200 and 400 euros per ton. And as we discussed, the study projects that the cost of green methanol could fall within that range by 2040. But of course, the cost of conventional methanol really depends on the price of natural gas. So they provide cost estimates for natural gas-based methanol using a range of natural gas prices. And they also look at the impact of CO2 emissions pricing. So, for example, they estimate that a CO2 price of 200 euros per ton of CO2 would add 383 euros to the production cost of conventional methanol.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It is, yeah.
Okay. So green methanol could become pretty competitive.
Yeah, especially, as the cost of renewable electricity continues to decline and we start to see more carbon pricing mechanisms being implemented around the world.
Right. Okay, so last question.
Yeah.
What about green ammonia? How does that fit into all of this? Is it a competitor or could they work together?
That's a good question. So the study actually found that energetically, green ammonia has a cost advantage over green methanol right now.
Okay.
But they project that that cost advantage will decrease by 2050.
Okay.
And they also investigated the possibility of, co-producing green methanol and green ammonia in integrated plants to take advantage of waste heat integration.
Oh, okay.
And they found that this could lead to some cost reductions for green methanol.
Gotcha. So they could potentially work together, in a synergistic kind of way.
Exactly.
Okay, now obviously every study has its limitations. What were some of the limitations and sensitivities that the researchers identified?
Yeah, so a few things they pointed out were that, they used a global uniform WACC of 7%, which is the weighted average cost of capital. But, regional variations could impact costs significantly. For example, they found that a 2% deviation in the WACC could lead to a 13 to 15% change in costs.
Wow, okay.
They also highlighted the sensitivity to electrolyzer costs. So if electrolyzer costs don't decrease as quickly as projected, that could increase the cost of green methanol. And perhaps most importantly, the pace of DAC technology advancement is a major factor. If DAC doesn't improve as quickly as they expect, then the cost of green methanol could be significantly higher.
Right.
They also looked at, plus or minus 10% changes in capital expenditures and operating expenditures for solar PV, wind power, and the methanol plants. And they found that had a smaller impact, but still relevant, around plus or minus 4% for the PV and wind-dominated regions, and plus or minus 1% for the methanol plant.
Okay.
And then lastly, they emphasize the benefits of using a hybrid PV wind system as opposed to just PV or just wind. So, in some regions, it's really important to have that mix of solar and wind to optimize the cost.
Well, that was a lot of information, but it's really exciting to see the potential of green methanol.
Yeah, it's definitely a promising solution.
It could be a real game changer for decarbonizing a lot of major sectors, and the projections indicate that it could be cost competitive within, a couple of decades.
Mhm.
But of course, a lot depends on things like, you know, continued progress in carbon capture technology and also, policies that incentivize the switch to cleaner alternatives.
Right. So hopefully you, our listener, can now kind of grasp the complexity and the potential of green methanol. We've gone through this deep dive and, we've seen the exciting possibilities.
Yeah, and on that note, here's something for you to think about. Given the massive global potential for green methanol production, what are the larger implications? Not just for the energy and chemical industries, but also for global trade and even geopolitics. As new green energy hubs potentially emerge around the world, I think there's a lot more to consider here. How might this shift impact international relations? What new opportunities will arise? And what challenges might we face? These are just a few things to ponder as we continue our exploration of the transition to a more sustainable future. So thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.